Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. We've been doing these programs for now probably far too long, in the sense that we'd hoped that by now we would have got through this pandemic and we could have left these programs, which were all designed, as it were, to try to help people through the medical, the legal, and the economic consequences of what has been an unprecedented pandemic in the world and in South Africa. Sadly, that is not the case, and one almost is sad to say this might have to continue for some while as we try to puzzle our way through an increasingly complex terrain. To help us do that today, we have Fatima Hassan, who's the head of the Health Justice Network Initiative, and has been, of course, a long-time human rights lawyer, and indeed was rather important, to put it mildly, during the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the battle to ensure that government was accountable then. So Fatima, thank you very much for your time and for helping us through what is a difficult period.
Thanks, Judge. It's great to be on the show.
Very good. And Fatima, can I ask you just to start with, I mean, your organization's perspective at the moment, there's massive criticism of government for waking up so late. There's increasing anger about the fact that we have to wait for the vaccines. Just on a general sort of assessment, bearing in mind that no government seems to have done this particularly well, how do you see what has happened? Just on a general, we start on a general basis.
Thanks. So I think generally government has not handled itself particularly well. It really hasn't impressed us in the last few months. We've been raising these issues for several months now. I mean, to the point where the Health Justice Initiative actually wrote to government and the Disaster Management Center, the different ministers, basically pleading and asking for them for information. So I think the lack of transparency and sharing of information with the public, and I think that lack of transparency continues, well into 2021 is a concern. And you're right, many countries were also caught in the back foot. Many countries have been using vaccines that may not be that effective. They've been using emergency use authorizations. But a lot of countries also engage in what we call vaccine nationalism. And as activists, we're quite concerned about that. We've been raising the alarm bells for months already. By August, reports were indicating that most of the global stock of the frontrunner vaccine candidates, for which research had not as yet been published, for which authorization had not as yet been secured, that most of the supplies had already been bought by wealthier nations through bilateral deals and through pre-commitments, or what we call AMCs, advanced market commitments, and through the COVAX mechanism. So already by August, there had been indications that the nationalism was particularly pernicious, and that it would mean that countries in the global south, or countries that didn't engage already in commitments through bilaterals or through COVAX, would actually not be able to secure sufficient supplies. That was worsened by what we call this intellectual property quagmire that we're in, and a refusal by many of the drug companies, in fact, all of them, not to share the technology, not to share the vaccine know-how, alongside increasing calls by many global activists and alliances to what we call free the vaccine. So in order to have a people's vaccine, a vaccine that's regarded as a public good, these drug companies would have to share the vaccine know-how and the technology with other companies well in advance, so that you could actually scale up manufacturing capacity. So, it's a bit of a complex set of factors. I think there's considerable systemic issues that we also need to factor in. And obviously, the focus for our organization has been the role of these particular pharmaceutical companies and these research institutions in creating the scarcity and in creating these global shortages. And the last point on that, Dennis, is that the South African government actually asked already in October of 2020 with the Indian government for a temporary waiver on intellectual property rules, so that we could address some of these barriers and some of the scarcity issues. And that proposal has been blocked since October by wealthier nations as well as pharmaceutical companies. And in fact, the South African government alerted the WTO to the potential problems we would face for the entire world, especially in the global south, to access vaccines in July of 2020 already. So it really is a combination, I think, of factors that has gotten us to this point where we still don't have a single dose in the country as at the 13th of January, and none of our healthcare workers have been vaccinated.
I think that most people would, well, let me put it this way, many people would agree, listening to you, to the notion that, as always, developing countries get pushed back into the queue, and pharmaceutical companies rent seek, even if taxpayer dollars or taxpayer dollars or pounds, or in fact rands, because we've done studies here, have been fundamental in getting the vaccine in the first place. But I suppose the question that I would be presumably asked by my listeners to ask is, well, other developing countries have done much better than us. Colombia, for example, seems to have acquired fairly vast amounts of vaccine. There are reports, I don't know whether they're accurate, that Kenya has done similarly, and other countries. So other countries seem to have battled their way through, if you could call it, the pharmaceutical stranglehold and the developed countries' greediness. And I suppose that the second question that comes out, which I'd just like you to answer is, okay, so how on earth then is one going to deal in the short run with the fact that, as you legitimately point out, the pharmaceutical companies have been decidedly unhelpful in relation to seeing this as a public good rather than as a means of profit?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. What we have been able to gather in terms of our engagements with other organizations around the world in explaining why some of the countries in the global south were able to vaccinate much sooner is that in some cases they decided to use what's called the Chinese vaccine, so Sinopharm and Sinovac. And in some cases also the Russians offered them millions of dosages of Sputnik. So in some cases in the Middle East, for example, they already started rolling out vaccines over the Christmas period. They were actually using the vaccine that was given by the Chinese authorities. In our country, of course, as you know, not a single vaccine has as yet been approved for clinical use because we have certain stringent regulatory standards and norms and procedures. But that doesn't mean that our government can only use that as an excuse. And I think you're right there. It definitely did not assert its authority with many of these pharmaceutical companies in the richer nations. We had warned already from March of last year that based on how the pharmaceutical industry dealt with the HIV/AIDS crisis in our country, to not rely on benevolence and hope and charity. You've got to get enforceable guarantees. We certainly alerted our government to the fact that you're potentially going to be facing scarcity and shortages of supplies. What is your plan? Have you called all these drug companies around the table? So I certainly think it's a combination of the fact that some countries decided to use different types of vaccines. Some countries pushed their way and really asserted their authority. And I think the Kenyan government in particular was very forceful with some of these companies.
They've got AstraZeneca.
Yeah. And then you must remember that also, if you don't plan in advance and you're not plotting and you're not, doing scenario mapping based on the fact that 4 trials are happening in your country, you can kind of have a sense of where the data is going, what's happening with the different early results that were coming out from some of these companies that were published elsewhere. You also needed to look at, well, what would happen if we did have a transfer of vaccine know-how? Could we manufacture? Which countries in the world could actually scale up manufacturing capacity? Could we offer something to these drug companies to say, if you actually gave us the know-how, the following companies have committed to manufacture for us in our part of the world? So it's a combination of governments that didn't want to assert their authority, governments that didn't plan properly. And I think there was a lot of reliance placed on the waiver. So the South African and Indian government definitely did not think that in a pandemic of this, with these kinds of consequences for the global community and for the global economy, that richer nations and drug companies would actually block the waiver. And so I think there was a bit of naivete on their part then. That seems to be shifting and moving because more countries are now being named and shamed because of their opposition. And that could, possibly change in the next few months, but that's going to be a little bit too late. The last thing here, Dennis, is that what the drug companies were doing before the data was even published and before it even came on the market or got emergency use authorization, they started engaging in bilateral agreements with certain manufacturers. And so they segmented the markets. And so there still has to be quite a thorough analysis done of why was it possible for certain countries to get the AstraZeneca vaccine sooner and other countries not. What we've discovered in the last week, obviously, is that Oxford University gave an exclusive license to AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca, in turn, sub-licensed to the Serum Institute. Serum Institute now has CIPLA for South Africa and some other sort of local suppliers. But the arrangement and the license agreement, which has not been made public, so this is basically through the work of investigative journalists and activists who are trying to piece together what those agreements says, is that they only allowed Serum to, for example, supply 20 countries in lower and middle income countries. And so our classification as a MIC, I think, has also harmed us, because that has meant that we were also not a priority for some of these sub-licensing benefits. And then we were also not beneficiary early on, or not prioritized sufficiently for some of the COVAX shipments. And we can talk about COVAX later, because that also is an imperfect mechanism and that doesn't seem to have worked. So if I circle back to your main question of how did we get to this point, is that COVAX was set up to address these very issues, that we would have global equity. The WHO said, what we want is drug companies to come into the umbrella of the CTAP or the COVAX, come and share your know-how, come and share your supplies. Let's allocate it based on need, not allocate it based on wealth. And the drug companies didn't cooperate, the rich nations didn't cooperate. CTAP doesn't have a single company that has come forward to the WHO and say, we will share technology in the middle of a global pandemic. So, there's so many people that have to account, and there's so many different layers of blame, but be that as it may, this is where we're at now.
Just let me go back to a couple of points. One, which I'm not sure everybody will understand, is you made a point about the waiver and the government's naivete in relation to the waiver. Can you just explain to people who are not particularly familiar with international trade law what in fact the waiver was?
Okay, so like I said, this all started with a lot of the work that has been done in the last 20 years by organizations like MSF around access to medicines. And inherent in that kind of approach or understanding is that we have to accept that medicines are a public good and that medicines are not a luxury, right? So based on that, and given the work that was done in HIV/AIDS to get us to the point of what's called the Doha Declaration, which would enable states and member states of the WTO in a public health emergency, in a public health crisis, to take certain state measures to be able to supply their population or their nation with a medicine or a vaccine that could actually save lives. So that's what we call the TRIPS flexibilities through the Doha Declaration, because of all of the work around HIV/AIDS. But in July already, our government, which was quite, this is the thing of, I don't know if government knows what it's doing in Geneva and what it's doing here. And I think that's another problem around these different arms of government, and sometimes there's no alignment. We haven't even had the president talking about the waiver, nor has he mentioned it in any of the presidential addresses. So what happens is, in July, this really very sound document is submitted by the South African government to the WTO to say, we're warning you that there's going to be a problem with the way in which intellectual property rules are applied in this pandemic, and it's going to have the following impact. And we are also saying to you that based on our assessment of how global South countries have dealt with different pandemics, it's almost impossible to use this Doha Declaration, and it's almost impossible and very difficult to use the Doha flexibilities, right? Or what we call the TRIPS flexibilities. So they set the scene for the fact that there's a major obstacle and there's a systemic problem, which is a combination of whether you have political will, whether you have the right domestic laws, the difficulties, the legal processes. It's quite difficult to actually use those TRIPS flexibilities. So we get to the point of October, South Africa and the Indian government, which is an important thing, because I think that was the reason why the Prime Minister of India decided to unban the temporary ban on exports, which is why we're actually going to get the 1.5 million dosages. So there's some BRICS engagement and partnership there. So they go to the WTO, and this is the waiver. Could we have a temporary waiver on all COVID-19 related diagnostics, therapeutics, including vaccines, any technologies, trade secrets, etc., temporarily for the duration of the pandemic until global population immunity or herd immunity is achieved? And it's a very narrow waiver that was actually being sought. So of course, as activists, we were criticizing the waiver for being too narrow, right? But in the realm of the way in which global power works, this was considered quite threatening. And in the global south, it was considered quite revolutionary. So initially, there were very few supporters of that TRIPS waiver request, but now there's over 100 different nations from the global south supporting that. And preliminary indications from this year, 2021, because of the realization by many countries of what global inequity means in respect of the vaccines for COVID-19, it seems like there's a shift by some of these countries to supporting the waiver. So that's what the TRIPS waiver is all about.
What would the effect of the waiver? What would the effect of the waiver be?
So the effect of the waiver would be that you basically don't have to enforce intellectual property protections on the vaccine know-how and technology. Of course, that would still require the companies to cooperate, to share the vaccine know-how. Yeah, but then also not restrict the number of companies that can actually make the vaccine. So if, for example, there are more than one company in India that can manufacture the vaccine, then you wouldn't just limit it to the Serum Institute. And, you know, MSF, for example, has said there are companies in Brazil, in India, there's at least 3 companies. The French government is now speaking to 3 different partly state-owned companies in France because there actually needs to be greater manufacturing scale-up. There's some preliminary...
Why could they not compulsory license in terms of the TRIPS agreement?
There we go. So that's the million-dollar question.
But we would still be, yes, we'd still be in trouble because we can't make the full vaccine here.
Well, so this is the part where there's also questions, and there isn't a lot of transparency, right? So BioVax got pre-selected by COVAX to potentially make one or more of the vaccines. After that initial public announcement, there's been no further information or details about whether COVAX is continuing with BioVax, whether BioVax will actually make the vaccine for any one of those front-runner vaccines that have been approved for use by COVAX. Similarly, Aspen gets an agreement which was signed months ago already, which was being negotiated for fill and finish, and then all 300 million first dosages will actually be exported. So, but the point, I think, is that you don't need to have local manufacturing capacity to be able to benefit from the vaccine transfer. The way in which the waiver and the declaration works is that any company anywhere in the world that has manufacturing capacity, bioequivalent, safety, of course, we're not going to make a vaccine in your uncle's garage, right? You're going to use a proper pharmaceutical company to do that.
I would hope so.
But yes, but if you segment the market and you limit it and you go to AstraZeneca and say 5 companies can make this, can you explain to us why you have only given a partial voluntary license to Serum, which in turn has restrictions on which markets it can serve and how many supplies it can provide and at what price? You know, there's issues in India around equity where Serum is charging a higher price for people who use the private sector in India. So the issues of pricing and global equity and segmentation of markets, and then of course the lack of pricing transparency. And I mean, you know, you're familiar with this in terms of how do you then, you know, determine whether something is a fair price or a low profit price or a no profit price are all of the issues that we're now having to deal with all at the same time, because proper planning actually didn't take place already from June of last year. And, you know, Dennis, I mean, you know, I'm the first to criticize the private sector, and I'm the first to say that pharmaceutical companies play a very difficult role, but it is disheartening after the HIV/AIDS crisis to see that our government did this. We warned them, we've been warning them since April of last year. The other human rights organizations were able to tell the world what was happening in terms of the buying up, the hoarding, the stockpiling. How could you not have known how could you not have known what is happening in the world? I mean, these reports were coming out, people were talking about it. So that for me suggests that, like, where was the planning? Was there anybody keeping track of this? And this is why we wrote to government. We said, we're just not seeing any information. There's no information sharing. Where is the National Command Council on this? And we were so fixated, I mean, government was so fixated on the beaches and the alcohol and the cigarettes, that it seems that somebody forgot to focus on the biggest systemic issues, which is you're going to have a supply problem and you need to, not just rely on the TRIPS waiver. It's important, yes, but you need to take some like concerted state action. And that's why we kept on saying, to your point of compulsory license, fix the patent law. So that law has been sitting in Parliament. In a pandemic, our Parliament, our legislature, has not yet passed it, which means it's unlikely that this government will ever pass it, because if you don't do it in this pandemic, in COVID, when are you ever going to do it? When will you use a compulsory licensing mechanism?
Okay, that's a good point. But let me, because of time, I want to move on to ask you this. If my calculations are right, what we do know, well, let me put it this way. What we think we know is that we're going to get 1 million doses by the end of this month and 500,000 doses by the middle of next month. I'm told, I understand that AstraZeneca, but I'm also told, I know, talking to Professor Gray, it is possible that you could give people a single dose and then hopefully within a reasonable time you get the second dose, and at least the first dose has an effect. Now, other than that, we're supposed to get enough to vaccinate 10% of the population. I'm not sure whether that's also AstraZeneca, but if it is, then that would have to be something like the 12 million doses in order to cover 10%. Beyond that, and a somewhat general statement by the president about 20 million more doses, which I'm not quite sure where that's supposed to come from, there is no information. So let's just take those first two. How is this country going to distribute this? This is a massive job. Would you accept that the private sector has a role here?
So definitely, I mean, the private sector definitely has a role in terms of assisting the nation with administering the vaccine and managing the rollout for the different priority groups. And so far, government has set out 3 priority groups. We're still challenging some of the definitions within those priority groups, right? But that's a separate issue. And we have always said for the last few months that in a pandemic of this nature, you need to have one plan, one procurement, one administration program with the support of business and the private sector. And I think this is the thing that really has to be recognized, is that all medical schemes have actually come on board. So all medical schemes, the private health sector, are actually agreeing to kind of an approach of equity into having a national procurement and a national distribution and administration program. And I think that is significant. Of course, the financing model is unclear. There's so much different pieces of information coming out over the last few days that nobody really knows how the financing is actually going to work, whether a special purpose vehicle is going to be set up, whether the Solidarity Fund is going to be the bank account, whether National Treasury is going to put the entire bill, whether we're going to take a loan from the World Bank or IMF, whether the AU Bank, different mechanisms are going to support it. So the financing is a big black box and is a big question mark. But let's come to the number of dosages. So yes, we have an in-principle agreement from Serum. And like I said, I think that's because of our BRICS partnership with the Indian government that initially had a ban on exports and has now lifted that ban primarily to benefit South Africa. So we get very limited dosages, 1.5 million of billions of dosages, but that could be sufficient to cover some of our healthcare workers. And if the clinicians suggest, because there's some dispute around what the early data is saying about whether you can wait more than 2 weeks or not for the second dose, I think our MAC advisory committee and clinicians like Glenna Gray and others would actually have to advise on that. We're now being told that potentially 12 million from COVAX, that is a number of 10%. But what we do know, based on what is happening with COVAX in terms of its inability to meet global equity and need, and even the MAC in its advisory of September, which is now on the website of the Department of Health, has said that COVAX is only likely to basically cover 3% of our population in South Africa, because there are other countries who are much poorer, who are ahead of the queue, and because COVAX two things, doesn't have all the funding and doesn't have all the companies there. So I think that's actually an overestimate. We do know that based on reports from today in the Business Day, that of the 200 to 250 million dosages from AVAT, which is the African Vaccine Acquisition Task Team, which is through the AU, which Cyril Ramaphosa was chairing. And again, there the financing is unclear. That involves J&J, AstraZeneca, and Pfizer, that we potentially could be able to get a stock of 12.2 million. And so that is something that has to be confirmed in the next few days.
Is that in addition to the COVAX?
Yeah, but COVAX is, I really think that's an overestimate, and we'll actually get much less.
You think COVAX is not 10%, but 3%?
Yeah, yeah.
Which would mean
if at all.
Which would mean 1.8 million doses rather than 12 million doses.
Yeah, so I'll be surprised if, I'll be very happy, but I'll be very surprised if COVAX can actually give you the enough dosages for 10% of your population or your adult population. Today, again, from the Business Day, we now find out that there's a potential of 9 million dosages from Johnson & Johnson. Now, this could be because the data is about to come out. There's some preliminary data which suggests that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine could actually work and is actually effective. And obviously, because Aspen is now finishing in, fill and finish, and the public is outraged about the fact that that would be a total export, there seems to be some conversations happening with Johnson & Johnson. But it's
do we know,
it's like
do we know whether Johnson & Johnson are manufacturing as we speak?
No, because they still have to get phase 3 data in.
Which means that's going to be quite a delay before that comes on stream. Okay, sorry, I interrupted you.
But what's significant, no, it's fine. What's significant is that if the Johnson & Johnson vaccine does work and if the data is good, it means that somebody has reserved potentially 9 million dosages for us, which is very different to 1 million dosages or 0 dosages. And so that is different because a lot of these drug companies, this is how they've operated in the last few months. They reserve dosages for you. It's almost like you're buying a PlayStation as opposed to buying a life-saving intervention. And so the issue then around equity is one then that it's playing out in the region and in the world. And so similarly in Africa, the concerns and questions around the initial dosages that would come through AVAT would be, but then where's the epidemiology and where's the public health need for your geographical spread of the 200 million plus dosages that comes from AVAT? Because every country in Africa is putting pressure on their governments to say, well, we want to be first in line. And so this is where the geopolitical wars are now playing out, because we're seeing increasing offers from the Chinese and Russian governments to offering many countries their vaccine if they don't want to use the Johnson & Johnson or Pfizer or AstraZeneca or any of the other vaccines that are being used in other parts of the world already.
But if you look at your calculations, from what I understand, you accept the 1.5 million, you think there's only 3% from COVAX, which is 1.8, and there then may be 9 million from Johnson & Johnson later in the year, and perhaps something from the AU. Is that right?
Yeah. But look, this is all speculation because every day
the
numbers change. And we were told 20 million dosages. I don't know what those 20 million dosages, the president really has to have a proper Q&A session.
Well, help me here. One of the issues that has come up time and time again, when I interviewed Professor Shrub, and I've tried to interview Professor Karim, but he declined the invitation, so I can't ask him. So let me ask you from your vantage point. The argument is, well, like, we can't tell you how much we're getting because we've got non-disclosure agreements. You've heard that, surely.
Yeah.
You're shaking your head. But I mean, you have heard the point made.
Yeah, I'm shaking my head in disbelief that that's still something that government is saying.
I mean, you're working with a whole string of international organizations. Tell me about that. I mean, is that just nonsense? Is there legal validity about that?
So in the Netherlands, they have classified it as state secret. And here we have
Yeah.
NDAs, and in other parts of the world, they're also invoking non-disclosure agreements, but this is the way in which pharmaceutical companies operate. Our argument as global activists is that in a pandemic of this nature, you can't be insisting on NDAs. There has to be full transparency, not just on pricing, but also on the terms and conditions of your licensing arrangements and agreements, especially when you're segmenting markets, because what you're doing is fueling distrust. You're fueling distrust among nations and amongst nation states, because if you don't tell us what you're actually allowed and permitted and agreed, what you're actually charging, we as citizens are, assuming that our government is withholding information from us. So assuming there is an NDA, and I'd really like to get confirmation from each of those companies that they actually insisted on an NDA in a pandemic, we would say lift the NDA. The public interest demands it, and there's like absolutely no reason
we could
to
know
honor
what's
that.
going on.
Yeah, because I think what's really ironic is the drug companies were in 1 week, we have the DDG saying there's an NDA, and then in the following days, the drug companies issue press statements saying this is the price offered, this is how much we offered, these are the supplies that we offered. So somebody, if there is an NDA, the PR departments are breaching those NDAs, right? And so the whole thing doesn't make sense. I mean, what we do know about, today is the 13th of January, right?
Today it's the 18th. Yeah.
Sorry. What we do know as at the 17th of January is that of all the millions of dosages of vaccines that have already been administered in the world, yesterday, 17th of January, 25 shots, 25, Dennis, were administered in Africa. So that tells you we don't just have a South Africa problem. We have a systemic problem around how Africa is prioritized for vaccine distribution. And the companies, the demand of global activists, and this is the letter that we all internationally, globally, a number of organizations and individuals wrote to the CEOs of these companies to say, commit to higher levels of transparency. Let us know the prices and let us share the vaccine know-how. And the pricing is important because there's now 5 different prices floating around the world. We now know through a mistaken tweet by a Belgian minister what the EU is actually paying for each dose for those companies. Right. We now know that the US is paying more than the EU. So there's tension brewing between the EU, the US, and the drug companies about why did you pay more? There is a different list, tiered pricing, 3 different pricings for COVAX. COVAX is saying they are a private foundation. They have no duty to disclose it. They also have NDAs, they claim, and they're saying it's a secret, it's confidential, so they won't tell us. Even though we're putting a couple of $100 million into COVAX, they won't tell us exactly what price that they've agreed to. And by the time you get that information, it could be like another 2 years' time, right? So the New York Times has called COVAX a big black box. It's just not committing to sharing of information, and we all enraged by that. And then similarly, AstraZeneca,
there are rumors that AstraZeneca wanted to extract a higher price from us than they were prepared to sell to the EU.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the really sad thing and enraging thing about the AstraZeneca Oxford University license and vaccine is that there's very little transparency around how the pricing was determined. There is this claim that it's a low profit price, but what the Financial Times was able to uncover was that AstraZeneca would determine for how long the low profit price would be in place, and they could determine at any time that the pandemic ends in June 2020 or July 2020. So it's the low profit price, it's tied to their ability to determine when in their view the pandemic ends, or when in their view the world has global herd or population immunity. But the false price, Dennis, is that our country and then other countries are engaging in bilaterals, and each bilateral has a different pricing arrangement and structure and system. And where you sub-licensed Serum, AstraZeneca says, well, go fight with Serum. Go tell Serum, what your supply issues and pricing issues. But the point is they are the ones who signed the main agreement. And as you mentioned earlier in the introduction, a lot of these front-runner vaccine clinical trials was accelerated on the basis of significant amounts of public investment and funding. Public Citizen has calculated that this is running into billions of rands. And I think that is why the EU is so upset and the US, because there was funding through the NIH, there was funding through different public health institutions. And the second thing is that a lot of the technologies that they're using was actually technologies that were researched by Ebola and HIV researchers. So a lot of this is, you're not really true innovation where you start from scratch. That is the reason why within a year we were able to have over 200 vaccine trials, 40 in phase 3 already, or 40 in human trials, and have by the end of the year a handful actually approved for use.
One final question, because I haven't got much time. All of this is now in a backdrop of a very significant anti-vaccine movement. Yeah. Now, are you worried about that?
Yeah. So
I am. So the question,
yeah, and this is the reason why we say to government, you've got to share information and be more transparent, because there is a growing anti-vaccine movement. And alongside the growing anti-vaccine movement, there is now vaccine hesitancy. When you have large groups of people seeing information changing on an almost daily basis, and different regulatory systems and rules for different countries, and different efficacy levels and different data being shared. If you don't share information, if you're not transparent, if you're not honest about your own shortcomings or where you don't know the answers, this is when misinformation gets fueled. And we know this from HIV/AIDS. If you don't take the public into your confidence, if you don't have every single leader, in society actually explaining to people that this could actually save you and could save others in your community, then we're in a problem. And so it's really important that some activists have already lodged a complaint against the Chief Justice for his utterances. We are working with faith-based organizations and trade unions to try and make sure that all of their members understand why a vaccine is actually important, and that if SAPA in South Africa actually approves something for use, then it's going to be based on sufficiently robust data.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are going to run out of time, so I need to thank you. Sure. Obviously, the topic carry on for a much longer time. I'm sorry about that. I'm very grateful that I'm very grateful for your information, because I think the public are entitled to it, and hopefully this will prompt an even greater debate. Fatima Hassan, thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure.